I'm glad you're here. I was just getting ready to read my story, Cacta, or, if you prefer, The Second Death, with the illustration by my talented friend Jacob Ziegler on the front. And there's a picture of a skull on the title page. Cacta, or The Second Death. For commonplace but mortal sins, Laura's deathbed grew cold and hard under her back. Her nightgown twisted into tattered cerements. Her children's voices receded as though they were blown into the sky. Her bedroom widened until the walls grew black, until the smallest roughness on the floor was a mountain, until a cloud of ash and pumice threw open the ceiling. She rose warily from the stone slab into which her deathbed had petrified, and found herself between the walls of a gray and lifeless valley. The smell of mud swept past her, then two bony, fleeing wretches. One, a hunched old boy with a bald spot burned into his hair, slowed slightly and lowered his head to say just one word to Laura, "Quickly." She bounded after the two of them, when boiling mud began to island her slab. Jagged stones on the ground opened her feet. The three of them huddled under the mouth of a cramped cavern in the side of the valley wall. "What are we running from?" asked Laura, turning her head to fit under the cavern. "That's not the usual question I hear from the newly dead," said the other wretch, a gangly young woman with wide running legs. Laura glanced back out into the valley from under the cavern roof. "There's no need for that. I realize I'm in hell." "A flood of the boiling sea of mud," the hunched boy answered. He gestured to the other side of the valley, hazed with smoke. "Look!" Laura squinted through the haze to watch bubbling mud surge down the side of the valley. Tossing bodies poured down with the flood. Laura's new acquaintances began to sob. "How did it happen?" she asked impatiently. "Some of the newly dead fall straight into the boiling sea of mud," the boy explained tearfully. "Many have fallen in all of a sudden, and now the sea pours over its edge. Such poor souls no doubt suffer the second death immediately." "The second death, you say? Has hope entered hell, then?" The young woman pressed her aching back rather than wipe tears from her eyes. "As much hope as has entered earth by there being hell at all. The second death promises no rest." "And who are you? For I am Laura Mercier, and I died during the battle of the plains of Abraham." "My name is Victoria," the young woman cried, as though she had forgotten. "And Nicholas," the boy said. He studied Laura, who did not look mangled. "You say you were killed in battle?" She shook her head. "I died in my bedroom of Tisic from artillery powder. My children were in attendance. I imagine my husband fights on." Nicholas scratched the burn on his head. A colorful crust caked over his and Victoria's fingertips. "We saw soldiers fall into the sea." "Don't be oblique, Nicholas. Do you tell me my husband has died or not?" "I tell you that if he died, he may have died again. You died to the north of the boiling sea of mud. Was your husband to the south of you?" "He was to the east, fighting at the church of Notre Dame de Victoire." "If he died there, then he would have fallen beyond a dreadful fortress that splits the valley into eastern and western halves." "What fortress?" Laura demanded of Nicholas, who took his gaze from her to look further into the cavern. A little gray cat slinked from the deeper shadows. Victoria let a stone fly silently from her hand. The stone killed the creature, and its carcass dissolved into a skein of black worms. Laura expected such behavior at these depths, and said, "Your ways are more suited to this country than mine. I've seen such creatures attack." Victoria flexed the fingers it had thrown as she stared at the writhing worms. "They would turn your insides into vermin if you would allow yourself to believe they're merely cats. Hell is a country of lies, my lady." "The fortress is called Cacta," Nicholas said. "This in the devil's barren tongue means just valley." If your husband's beyond it, you'll never see him. You speak as if you know he's dead. I've seen soldiers fall beyond Cacta today. Soldiers mingled with broken stained glass, mingled with great stone crosses and ruined guns. The pictures of Laura's Victor besieged her memory. She heard him laugh in spring. She watched him awaken in the morning. She felt herself undulate beneath him at night. The pictures froze her tongue, and she swore silently her search would end either in Victor's arms or not at all. Nicholas detected a new desperate quiver on Laura's clay-white lips. You must see now that he's forever beyond you. It's immutable that no one who enters Cacta may come through to the other side. Who do you think I am? Laura snapped. I don't respect this place's law. A curse is weaved into the stones of Cacta, Victoria warned. If it's your husband you seek, out of your dear love for him, then you'll surely perish a second time. And what if I die again? Will a third death await me, and then a fourth? Nicholas and Victoria began to laugh at Laura's outburst, laughing as though she had just then invented humor. Their fits weakened into rasps like those of Tisic sufferers, and Laura went on. I will find him and cleave to him, and with him be one flesh, as the true law requires. Nicholas grasped her by the wrist as though she would bolt from the cavern that instant, but he'll be slain who wanders the ramparts of Cacta while in the throes of love. You cannot love your husband in Cacta and live, said Victoria. If you do, you will suffer the second death, where you will be bitterly alone. Then I'll hate him while I'm within. Laura peered carefully from the cavern and looked along each end of the valley. And how do you know you're east from your west? Nicholas reached a small hand out into the valley. An ill wind blows forever south. And suppose I should leave the valley and bypass Cacta. Impossible. Victoria shook her head. If you've not died enough for one day, I presume we could at least assure you as late a death as we can. Were you to climb the south side of the valley, you'd merely be lost in the boiling sea of mud like so many of your husband's brothers. The sea is no further from the valley than wine in a glass is from the hand. And the north side? Beyond the north side is the country of great screaming, where the rat males hunt. The screaming does not cease. It escapes no lips, and is as much a feature of the land as the boulders and tarns. The denizens of that country are the only ones the screaming cannot drive mad, and so their disabled prey is easy to catch. A horrid quiet blew over the valley, and even the sea of mud stopped rolling. Nicholas and Victoria closed their eyes and squeezed closely to the walls of the cavern. Laura felt an urge to do the same as a giant skull like a moon floated over the valley. Distantly she saw it hover over a group of huddling wretches and draw them up by an invisible strength into the skull's great stretching mouth. Laura herself felt the pull of the sending that drew those wretches up. She squeezed the rocks beside her so as to avoid its pull any further. The skull finished feeding and drifted away over the boiling sea of mud. Sound returned. Nicholas and Victoria glanced at Laura. She had moved her gaze east. Nicholas loosened himself from the cavern wall. You'll not be so resilient forever, Laura. How far is Cacta from here? Not far, Victoria estimated, but you'd be canny to stay toward this northern side. Yes, who knows what mud might fly upon my cerements? It isn't only that, dear. In a pit in the center of the valley, under the shadow of Cacta, there dwells blind Hazel, the gigantic head, perhaps a cousin of that which floated by, but one with arms rather than eyes. Not arms, Victoria, Nicholas interrupted, but great antlers. She scours the valley with them and pushes sinners into her pit. I've heard blind Hazel's appendages described in both ways, and as the branches of a dead or sickly tree. It appears Laura will be so lucky as to decide soon for herself. Godspeed, Laura said to them, rising to a crouch under the ceiling of the cavern. I'll ask you to make one last consideration before you throw yourself to the worst horrors below us, Nicholas said. It'll be of no use. You tell us your husband surely is to the east of Cacta. Perhaps, if he died defending this church you speak of, the good Lord rewarded him. Victor whispered to me during countless embraces of his hope that we spend eternity together, even an eternity of damnation. This sinful unbosoming is certainly one that the good Lord would happily oblige. I know this, and I know where he died, and so I know my husband is with those who fell to the valley east of Cacta. Without repeating her farewell, Laura slipped away from her wretched friends and hugged the craggy northern wall of the valley, inching eastward. She walked over the unwholesome and pungent remains of creatures that had fallen from the escarpment above, the southernmost border of the country of great screaming where the rat males hunt. The remains were all of a kind, a hunched and snouted race. These remains never thinned as Laura crept east to Cacta. She stepped slowly to make certain her bare feet never touched them. It did not take a long walk, even in her fashion, to see the black spires of Cacta, nor the hole in the ground she had been warned about. Nothing peered from the hole, but as Laura drew nearer to it she found, sprinkled among the remains of the rat males, brittle twigs or fingers, she could not tell, and she wanted to touch them no more than the bones they lay about. As Laura clung to the northern escarpment, she watched helplessly and screamed unheard warnings as a dozen pitiful and rag-worn souls bounded down the valley's very middle. They were widows, Laura thought, informed of their husband's whereabouts, but not of Cacta's guardian. As the widows approached the pit, the blind, bald, and grub-white Hazel beset them, rising from her nest by the tendrils on her chin. From between her wet, parted lips she sputtered the noises of dying dogs. Blind Hazel raked the edges of her nest with the branching appendages that replaced her eyes. They were not arms, though they wriggled, nor antlers, though they erupted from her head, nor the branches of trees, though they were encrusted with bark. They were none of these things, and all three. Laura now had very little trouble making her feet move, even as the widow's blind Hazel, dragged into the pit, cried frantically. She was out of the creature's reach, who could stretch her appendages only so far. Blind Hazel saw Laura, or noticed her, as she raced down that part of the valley between the nest and Cacta. She made no attempt to grasp at Laura, but lowered warily back down into the pit until Laura saw not a hint of her. The screams from the bottom of the pit hadn't stopped. As Hazel descended once again, the screams only grew. Soon Laura escaped sight of blind Hazel's nest. She walked toward Cacta head on. She no longer clung to the rocks of the escarpment, too hateful and unwilling to accommodate any beast who wished her ill. The fortress stretched from the northern to the southern escarpment. At the top of each stood thin, miserable towers from whose topmost windows shone wavering candlelight, and the shadows of those things who had lit them. The walls were black brick, but the torches cast a ruby glaze against them. The moat was not water, but a great empty and endless chasm. The drawbridge lowered. Laura did not stop to gawk, but stepped onto the bridge and passed its fat spiked chains. A torchlit corridor lay before Laura with rows of paintings along the walls. Beyond, at the end of the corridor, a second drawbridge lowered and tempted her to run. Laura did not. At first she felt it would reveal the forbidden emotion, her impatience at sinking into Victor's arms. She pushed that from her mind. No, she was glad to postpone her meeting with him for as long as possible. The paintings on the walls were set inside of wide, ornately carved and gilded wooden frames. Laura shuddered at them. They were paintings of her. There she was in Beauport, laying her eyes on Victor for the very first time. The demons had been there, taking note of the meeting invisibly. Her mind was again ensconced in sweet memories. The shore, his eyes, his voice. She forced into herself the thought of the tiny orb of spittle that escaped Victor's mouth at this first greeting, and refreshed her thoughts of hatred. There they were in the church of Notre Dame de Victoire, freshly wedded, in each other's embrace. Victor's voice had cracked when the priest asked him the questions. Laura could not stop herself from gaping at each painting, as no one who discovers a gallery of his life could do. The hatred she felt was false, and yet Cacta did not recognize the warped love that twisted its way through the hate she manufactured. She stared at each painting, as slow and as torturous as this made the otherwise straight and simple walk down the corridor. With each painting, with every step, she made herself remember Victor hatefully, what he'd done, what he'd forgotten. In moments her paradox erupted in her heart and was shed in her mind. To pretend to hate Victor meant to undertake a journey through Cacta to find him. To truly hate him meant to make no attempt whatsoever, to stay in that cavern and throw rocks for eternity at cats. Perhaps, Laura wondered, her lies pleased the fortress, or perhaps it didn't understand love enough to recognize them as lies. Perhaps, she wondered as the figure at the end of the corridor grew closer, her guides had lied to her, and indeed, after all, no curse was weaved into Cacta. Perhaps Nicholas and Victoria were merely demons who hoped to wrest her from any love her heart retained. The torches lit the figure, yet had they not, Laura would have known her husband who had come to find her too. She screamed his name as her knees weakened. The echo carried her voice to him. She was safe, and so was he. She had been lied to. The warped love in her breast for which Cacta had not destroyed her assured her of this. Victor screamed back Laura's name. He was wrapped in his own ruined uniform. His face was twisted and his body was stretched with artillery burns. They each charged down the long black ruby corridor, no longer heeding a stroke of paint, certainly not when reality bounded toward them. Between bright smoking torches, Laura and Victor came together, embracing so wildly that their bodies spun. Their hearts beat madly and mighty blows struck them from within. The little streams of love that had bubbled from between the cracks in Laura's false hatred spilled as through a ruined dike. The torches all blew out at once, but a greater blackness overtook Laura and her husband. 2 souls rather than 1 that day suffered in Cacta the second death. In a dead and lightless void, Victor and Laura embraced for eternity, blown through the emptiness by burning and freezing winds and by the breath of their screams. It was Nicholas who had told Laura that in suffering the second death she would be bitterly alone, but it was Victoria who had said that hell is a country of lies. Thanks so much for stopping by, and I'll see you next time on House Call with Dr. Schranz.